Hi, and welcome to Academic Compliance Academy. In this video, I'm going to talk about the rise of dynamic risk-based compliance, or I'm going to give some highlights, historical highlights, on how did we end it up here. So one of the biggest written compliance evolvements that have happened throughout time was the 10 Commandments, or any commandments by any religion. Because what these commandments did was they forced people to reflect on behavior and see if they complied with the commandments. So the 10 Commandments was religious guidelines on how to be a good Christian. And what this aimed at was the personal compliance, not the corporate compliance, because corporations did not have to comply with the 10 Commandments per se. That was not the ideal. This was a personal compliance to comply with society's expectations, or in this case, God's will. So when we talk about compliance, it's not a new thing happening or evolving in the 90s or the 2000s. It is fairly old, but just to say that it has always existed in some sense, because there will always be societal expectations, small societies, bigger societies, where there are some incorporated rules or commandments that a person must comply to. So going to up in history, the legal compliance base from where we stand now was developed throughout Europe when the Constitution started in the 1800s. And they symbolized the establishment of institutional compliance. So before this revolution, we had monarchies, we had God, we had people or a power that was superior to law. So the legal compliance frame actually has the foundation in the constitutions in Europe that arose in the 1800s. So now there was expectations to the countries. They were the unit where citizens and individuals had to comply with the legal regime that the country had established. Property rights, human rights, the rights to assembly, all of these really constitutional foundations. That was the start of the legal compliance range. So an economic side of this, and really important event in terms of how economics and corporate behavior has changed through time, was the Wall Street crack. Because if we go back to 1929, the Wall Street crack was, of course, a disaster economically wise. But in the aftermath of the Wall Street crack, we saw that ownership of companies got spread out, because we had dispersed ownership instead of having a very concentrated, a few owners for each company. This spread ownership have had the effect that corporations suddenly had to behave according to the stakeholders, to the owners, and their demands. So instead of having owners who might be in the board themselves, the executive board, and kind of running the business by themselves, we now had a dispersed ownership, which means that suddenly it wasn't the person who had to comply, but the company had to apply to the expectations of the owners. And with the dispersed ownership, that can somehow represent a more societal expectation. Furthermore, if we go up through history, we can see cases like Enron, right? These big disaster cases where we can see that these cases, these phenomenons, they happened because there were expectations from society. So where of course we had a legal baseline and we had the 10 commandments giving some kind of personal compliance to society, the spread ownership and of course the increasing regulations through these economic crises, because they hurt society, establish an expectation from society for corporate behavior to align with society's expectation. We also saw that in the financial crisis in the 2000s, and lately we have seen it through money laundering crisis, climate changes, where suddenly companies, even though they're not doing anything specifically illegal, now I'm talking climate change, they can still be punished by society for not complying to their strategy or what they publicly announce. So there's kind of like a societal expectations that is not complied with, and that will hurt the company in some sense through stock markets or in other areas. Of course, money laundering is a crime per se, but the cases we have had, like Danske Bank and Commerzbank and all the other ones across the European Union, well, let's say, so there's a fine, there's a court ruling about a court ruling that will decide what was illegal and what was not illegal, but the actual compliance effect that we see in society and the society's expectations and primarily the distrust towards banks, that is what I'm trying to focus on, and I'm trying to tell you that societal expectation has a huge impact on how we have to conceive compliance now, going from a pure legal compliance into a more societal compliance, where we have to both comprehend the legal side but also the expectations from society. Of course, EU law, being in the EU law is not something that we can just ignore. With the establishment of the European Union, what we did was we raised the bar for legal compliance. Before, each member state could have their own legal system and operate how they wanted. And they were much more, what would you say, that they were much more vulnerable if there were like political drifts in society. So in that sense, the legal mortality was higher than it is now because of the European Union. With the establishment and the treaty-based principles, we have kind of designed a more robust legal baselines where politics happening right here and now, even though it might be the opinion and the democracy deciding, we have to go back and we secure that we're not doing something that's fundamentally against the principles that we all share in the European Union. We've seen it with the immigration crisis. We've seen right-wing politics rising in different areas. And what is important to constantly remind ourselves is that you might be pro-EU, you might be against, but what is also important in the EU, and especially when in terms of compliance, is that it's also a securitization of, example given, human rights. So it's established at a large fundamental union structure. So we don't, for the first, of course, don't go into war with each another, but also that we kind of have an oversight that long-term compliance is secured, even though there might be political drifts from year to year in member states. Beside the EU, we of course have the UN, which was founded after the Second World War. So the UN is a bit special because where the EU has its Court of Justice, so it can actually direct sanction. The UN, for all its conventions, does not have the same ability. So when we look into compliance and look at the UN, what the UN is, it establishes policies and conventions that member states can apply to. They can sign these conventions and say, okay, we're going to implement these in national law. What the UN cannot always do is enforce it, and that's kind of the downfall, because you cannot secure that they're not members of the UN that will use the ability to be free riders, which means not really do what they signed up to do. So UN, but it's a good policy driven. It also has an aim to secure peace and drives the world and humanity in one direction. So even though it cannot sanction always directly, it does have a political impact. And since the EU typically implement conventions and the legal standards from the convention in the European Union legislation, then it becomes tangible, it becomes enforceable in the EU. So it does have a direct effect on member states and compliance. Last but not least, one of the things that of course has really raised the roof when it comes to importance of dynamic compliance, that is globalization. Globalization is magnificent because it has changed humanity. Internet have changed. We are so interconnected, everyone, and the level of information that we can gather today, in contrary to 2,000 years ago, it's crazy. But we must also be aware the downfalls of globalization. And in these times, with wars happening within the European continent and supply deficiency and everything, we're starting to see the downfall of globalization. Because even though in economics the like baseline is that the faster we can trade, the faster transfer we can make every day, the better it is, because no transfer happens if anyone has a loss in the transaction. So I would never buy something from you if it wasn't worth more to me than what I'm buying it from you, than what I'm buying it for, and you wouldn't sell it if it wasn't less worth for you than the price I'm paying. So in that sense, economic works that every transaction is actually good, and the speed of course just enhances the value and the prosperity of the common baseline. So what we have though seen the latter years is that maybe the speed has gone over the top, because speedy economic transfers might be effective, but they also increase the risk of misuse. And we've seen that through the money laundering cases throughout the world, also with corruption, different types. So even though the speed is really fast and it's effective, or let's say it's smart, well, there's no time to really investigate. And that is kind of the downfall and the main driver behind all these scandals. So I think we might have to look at globalization and saying, okay, it was a good driver, it connected everything. It also made everything based on risk. And of course, when we talk dynamic compliance, it is risk-based. So it arrived from globalization, because we can never know everything. There's always asymmetrical information, especially when transactions are very speedy. So if we're buying something from China that has to be delivered in UK within a week, but there are like 7 subcontractors around, how will you know and secure that no child labor has been used in this process by clicking something on the internet? Well, you can't. So there will always be asymmetrical information, and with speedy transfers, there's no time or securitization of trying to prove that there are no problems in this process. So globalization has of course increased transfers, but it's also really underlined the element of risk and why everything has a risk. Because in a very highly transactional world, well, risk will always be there. There's nothing called no risk. You always take a risk. So globalization, final step, but very, very important for the establishment of compliance, and especially dynamic risk-based compliance. So this was kind of like just a brainstorm of certain events taking you from, okay, personal compliance, 10 commandments, that's like a lot of years ago, and then how the whole legal system, how the economic disperse of ownership, how everything like builds on each other, creating the baseline for globalization, and thereby the element of risk that just has increased and increased, as we also saw onto the financial crisis, where risk just exploded because of the globalization. So this is why we need compliance, and we need dynamic compliance, and we need to be able to be good at dynamic compliance, because this is a world we live in. We might take a few steps back, giving investigative time and trying to secure less asymmetrical information, but we can never go back or go out to having no risk. Risk is here and risk will always be here, which is why we have to talk about risk-based compliance, dynamic compliance. So stay tuned, follow this channel, and let's talk more compliance.